They pushed me off the deck like I was a piece of luggage. Wave to the dolphins, my daughter-in-law said with a smile that did not touch her eyes as she guided my arm toward the rail and then, in a movement that was practiced and cold, let go. I fell into the water and the world narrowed to the slap of foam, the taste of salt, and the sudden, blazing thought that the people closest to me wanted me gone for $30 billion. I survived. I should have died that day. If you are watching this, subscribe and tell me where you are watching from. It helps to know who is listening as I tell you what they thought they had erased. Let me go back a little because the story is about blood, contracts, greed, and a betrayal that used legal papers for camouflage. And because you need to understand who I was before I became the target and then the architect of a revenge that smelled of lemon polish and old ledger books. I am 68, retired from a career in hospital administration, stubborn, with hands that remember stitching budgets and delivering bad news. I grew up in a small coastal town where trust was currency and neighbors mended nets together, not fortunes. My husband, Thomas, built a company that sold surgical equipment worldwide and left a trust that, on paper, was solid and irrevocable. After his death, he left a legacy and a pattern of people who circled like vultures. My son, Daniel, was always a soft man, a literature professor who loved books more than bank statements. My daughter-in-law, Elise, whose family had surgically sculpted smiles in glossy magazines and whose skin never bore the lines of honest work, learned early how to make a smile feel like consent. There was also Mara, the lawyer, who wore precise suits and practiced language like a scalpel. Victor, the accountant, who kept numbers as if they were private letters. Dr. Chen, the orthopedic surgeon, who signed my post-surgery notes with an efficiency I mistook for care. Claudia, the nurse, who brought me tea and whispered warnings. Marco, the marina manager, who knew when our guests arrived. Rosa, the housekeeper, who cried when she realized envelopes were missing. And Javier, the fisherman, who found my watch washed ashore. Each of these people had a role, and I will name them because names are how we hold people accountable. The backstory of my life is short on scandal and long on the kind of trivial kindnesses that make a person vulnerable to betrayal. And here is the part you must hear in full so you know why I trusted them and why their betrayal felt like a theft of more than money. I was a daughter of a nurse and a mechanic, taught to count out change and to fix things that were broken. I learned to file records and to read lab reports before I learned to read poetry aloud. I married Thomas when I was 29 and watched him build a company from a garage into a chain of hospitals and a private research facility. We built a home that smelled of lemon oil and old books, a house that sat on a cliff with a view of a harbor, and there we collected small rituals. After Thomas died of a silent heart attack, the trust instruments he left were complex. There were residuary clauses, a life estate for me, a trust for research funding, and a power of attorney that could not be changed without 2 independent witnesses and a certified attorney. For years, I thought legal language was a lock that kept thieves out. I was wrong. I was also naive about how love can be used as evidence in court of consent. I slowed down after the second hip surgery. My gait changed, my hands trembled when the coffee was too hot. Simple things that used to belong to me were suddenly topics of conversation. I will give you a scene that shows how subtle the takeover was. One evening in my living room, the light was honeyed, the hardwood had the faint smell of polish, and Elise sat opposite me, feet crossed, phone in her lap, the glow reflecting in her pupils. She said in a voice as soft as tissue paper, "Mom, have you thought about simplifying the trust? It would be easier for everyone if things were streamlined." I felt the words as small pinpricks. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Just paperwork," she said. "Power of attorney could be consolidated. Probate is messy when there are disputes." She named probate as if it were a tedious errand. I asked Daniel, who was reading a book and not looking up, "Did you talk to her about this?" He shrugged. "We were just helping." That exchange had all the textures that would later make friends call it manipulation. The air smelled like citrus cleaner. I felt the rawness in my hip where surgery had opened me up months earlier. Elise's perfume left a floral note in my nostrils, and the quiet of the house somehow made the words heavier. The first concrete threat to my autonomy was a stack of forms left on my kitchen table, like an unquestionable offering. A new durable power of attorney form, a proposed amendment to the trust, a bill from a new law firm in town. The signatures on the witness lines were not yet inked. I should have torn them up. I should have closed the house and stopped answering the door. But grief is slow and paperwork is patient. The next scene that mattered was the day on the yacht, a routine family celebration for what they called my recovery brunch after hip surgery. The deck smelled of teak and suntan lotion. The sun was horizontal and gilding everything in untruth. The champagne was bright and fizzy against the tongue, gulls cried overhead, and someone had brought a bouquet that pricked at the throat like the idea of spring. Conversation was lacquer thin. Elise touched my hand with a softness that felt like the first page of a good lie. Daniel kept offering me oysters while talking about taxes. Mara, the lawyer, was there by coincidence, she said. I always come to family events. In the galley, Victor, the accountant, laughed in a way that boned the air. There was a small fight over a radio station, a clink of silverware, the squeak of the life jacket harness when Marco adjusted it, and then the push. It was not shouted or dramatic. Careful near the rail, someone said, a line that would later be quoted in depositions. Mom, look at the dolphins, Elise whispered. My hand found the rail, and then an absence of hands where warm fingers had been. I tasted salt, metal, the hot sting of chlorine, and the sharp caramel bitter of fear. I went under, and in the brief seconds of cold, I understood the plan. When I surfaced, coughing the sound of my own lungs, I met the thin blue of the sky and Daniel's face a silhouette, the yacht receding, the laughter like a soundtrack to a funeral. That was the incident. The evidence that followed came in fragments, as if someone had tried to reconstruct a mosaic after destroying it. My watch, engraved with Thomas's initials, washed up near a pier, found by Javier the fisherman, who had a face like weathered wood and eyes that never lied. I remember him coming to my door with damp hair and a small wrapped object. He said, "I think this belongs to you." I smelled tar and salt on his coat, saw the ring of water on the paper he used to wrap the watch, felt the roughness of his palm as he handed it to me. That watch became the hinge of everything. I called Claudia, the nurse, and she came with peppermint tea, the steam warm on our faces, and told me what she had seen. I called the police. The first report was sympathetic but cursory. That is when I realized survival would not be enough. I would need proof. I began to collect small things, the way people collect coins. I learned to photograph documents with a shaky hand, the camera capturing paper fibers and the stamp of a notary, the smell of ink like a promise. I kept voice memos of conversations when Elise asked again about simplifying the trust. I recorded a meeting in which Mara, in her blunt, precise voice, said, "We could have this all settled in probate quickly if the life estate were rewritten and a successor trustee named." In that meeting, I made Daniel repeat aloud that he agreed, which he did, his voice small and wet with the need to keep peace. Every scene had a texture, the creak of the office chair, the cold tile under my feet in the medical clinic, the metallic tang when I opened a manila envelope and found a medical certificate with a doctor I had never met signing about a cognitive decline. The more I gathered, the clearer the pattern. At least 5 professionals had been involved in the plan. A technical note for you about probate and power of attorney, because the law is part of the weapon set they used. Probate is the judicial process by which a will is proved valid or invalid and assets are distributed, and a power of attorney grants legal authority to act on another person's behalf, often durable to survive incapacity, but it must be executed with capacity and without undue influence. Undue influence occurs when the testator or grantor is coerced or manipulated, and courts look for signs such as isolation from independent advisors, sudden changes to documents, and medical records that support diminished capacity. There was a fabricated medical note that claimed mild cognitive impairment, a note that to a cursory reader would seem plausible. I had that note analyzed. The lab report read like this in plain language so you understand the mechanics. The forensic handwriting analysis indicated that signatures on a consent form were produced in a pressured pattern inconsistent with my usual fluency. A certified document examiner compared ink aging and found anomalies. A digital forensics technician traced an email that uploaded a scanned power of attorney document from an IP address traced to Mara's office at 02:34 p.m. the day before the brunch. These details matter because they convert suspicion into evidence. I am telling you this in the clipped voice of someone who had to learn legalese as a second language. At about 1/3 into what I had to do, after I had gathered audio recordings, photos, receipts, and a notary-stamped page that suggested someone had been present who had not, I did something I had never done before. I asked the internet for a private investigator. The investigator came recommended by a friend of a friend, and his name was Paul, a man with a lopsided grin and a trench coat that smelled faintly of coffee and old books. He brought methods and a respect for detail that I did not have. Paul introduced me to an unlikely coalition. There was Nurse Claudia, who kept my medication list, Javier the fisherman, who retrieved small items from the surf, Rosa the housekeeper, who had kept a box of letters, Marco the marina manager, who remembered the timeline of the yacht docking, and a young paralegal named Lila, who worked at Mara's firm and slipped me an email she had saved in a draft folder. I will name each because each person risked something to help me, and they deserve to be recorded. The initial investigation scenes were tactile and slow and full of arguments about trust. I sat at my kitchen table with Paul, cups of coffee cooling, the smell bitter and honest, and we went through every receipt, every doctor's bill, every text message. Paul would say, "Tell me what it felt like when you were alone with them," and I would try to describe sensations because sometimes the physical memory holds proof that words cannot. I began to plant small traps. I sent Elise a text that simply read, "Can you bring the amended documents to my house tomorrow? I want to see them before I sign." I left a voice memo that said, "I am thinking of changing the life estate to Daniel and leaving a small fund to the hospital." And then I ensured that voice memo was later played back to an arranged witness. I also began to leak misinformation about a new independent trustee I had selected, a retired judge named Margaret Reyes, who was in fact real and in town, and agreed to play a role that would flush them into action. I orchestrated small psychological nudges, a war that was more about pushing strings than about punching people. This was the plan phase, and I took it seriously. I wrote notes to myself in a leather journal, the paper smelling like cedar, to remind me of what Thomas taught me, that patience and paperwork win over sudden fury. The war of documents was a chess match. I had two procedural descriptions that are important to understand because they were the scaffolding of my strategy. First, an autopsy note that would later become critical had to be interpreted in plain terms. In technical description, the autopsy review focused on presence of blunt force trauma inconsistent with a fall from standing height and presence of water in the lungs that suggested the timing of submersion was immediate. The pathologist wrote a supplemental report clarifying that while drowning was ruled a cause of death in one subject, in my hypothetical scenario, that report could be used to challenge a staged accident. Second, a procedural description of probate challenges explained how a will or trust can be contested on grounds of undue influence and incapacity, requiring collection of contemporaneous medical records, witness testimony, handwriting analysis, and chain of custody for documents. These procedural steps each took pages to organize and required a certified paralegal and a team of experts who could translate lab results into sentences a judge would accept. The moment of execution of my plan was sensory-dense and required disguises that were small and theatrical. I arranged to appear as if I had become reclusive, sending to social media a short video of me in my armchair, saying I was withdrawing from public life. I sent Elise a photo of an envelope full of blank checks addressed to a foundation, and then I arranged a meeting in which I pretended to want to sign amendments to the trust in Mara's office. The real game happened elsewhere. I planted a recording device in the glove compartment of Elise's car. The device caught a longer conversation than I expected. You will hear the exchange if you listen to the exhibit, but I can quote it here because it was the pivot. Elise said, "We have to finalize it this week. Once the power of attorney is signed, the life estate can be vacated and the trust transfers to Daniel's control with us as trustees. $3 billion is too much to leave messy." Mara said, "We will make the medical documents credible. Dr. Chen is on board. He will sign an assessment that shows diminished capacity." Victor added, "I will move assets to offshore accounts and set up a shell corporation to receive the remainder if necessary." Daniel, caught in the audio, said, "I just want to keep peace." The voices were crisp, the air conditioning hummed in the background, the clink of a coffee cup, the scrape of a chair leg across tile. That recording would become the dagger. Confrontation came in a rented conference room at a downtown firm where a camera crew and a legal team waited. I could have gone to the police at the first sign, but I chose theatrical exposure because I wanted them to feel the shame of public revelation before the law clenched its jaws. The scene was a closed room with a brown oak table, the smell of new polish, and the camera lens reflecting the whites of our faces. Dialogue in that confrontation was long and deliberate. Elise began, "What is this? You have no right to record us." I sat forward, my hip complaining with a dull ache, and I said, "You pushed me into the water. You forged documents. You and Mara and Victor plan to rewrite my life estate." Mara's voice did not falter. "You are delusional. These changes were in your best interest. You required management." Paul played the recording. Elise's face changed from composed to the rawness of someone caught mid-performance. The exchange that followed had 8 distinct turns, each one a small battle. Elise snapped, "You think I would do that?" I answered, "I heard you. Your voice is on tape." Mara tried to interject with, "This is entrapment." Paul responded, "The recording is lawful and it corroborates witnesses." Victor, sweating, muttered, "We were only helping." Daniel, finally looking up, said, "I did not know." I said, "You said you agreed on that tape." Daniel put his head in his hands and said, "I am sorry." The room had the metallic tang of coffee, the sharpness of fluorescent lights, the soft rustle of papers, the cool slickness of a leather chair under my palm. The tension paragraph that follows I will slow down to describe because it was several minutes of an internal earthquake. I felt my pulse slow and then surge, my palms sweating, the smell of antiseptic, and the memory of Thomas telling me that honesty is a slow burn that eventually reveals itself. The legal machinery did what it is supposed to do with evidence. An emergency petition to freeze assets was filed. The county filed for an injunction to prevent transfer of funds pending trial. The technical description of the freeze is as follows, in practical terms for laypeople. When an emergency asset freeze is granted, the court issues an order to third parties, such as banks and trustees, to halt distribution and secure accounts, and any attempt to transfer funds after the freeze can give rise to contempt of court. The injunction was granted in 36 hours after the recording was submitted to the clerk, with affidavits from Claudia, Javier, Leela, and a handwriting expert. The arrest sequence unfolded like the end of a long novel. Federal and local agents served search warrants at Mara's office and at Victor's accounting suite. Boxes were sealed and cataloged. The first person to be taken into custody was Victor. He was reluctant, his face creased, the smell of expensive cologne contradicting the weight of chain of custody forms he would later sign. Mara was cooperative initially, and then less so. Elise was brought in last. Daniel watched as his wife was led past him in handcuffs. I remember the clack of their shoes against linoleum, the way sunlight threw bars of light across the courtroom steps, and the silence that followed as if the world had inhaled. The confessions came in pieces. Facing subpoena, Victor cut a deal and described offshore transfers, naming accounts and flowcharts that auditors later traced. Mara denied at first, and then, when presented with incontrovertible paper trails and the recording, she confessed in a recorded statement that was played in court. Elise's confession was more complicated. Under cross-examination, she said, "I did it for my family. I thought we were protecting our children." The prosecutor asked her to specify who benefited and how she conceived the plan. She said, "We were owed a future." Her voice had the texture of someone whose confidence had curdled into regret. Sentencing took months. The legal consequences were precise, the restitution calculations meticulous, the trust documents examined line by line. In court, the judge cataloged the evidence, the tapes, the forged medical attestation, the chain of emails from Mara's office. The punishments included multi-year sentences, restitution orders, and disbarment for Mara. Victor faced banking charges and served time. Elise received a sentence that accounted for her cooperation and her role in the conspiracy. Daniel, who had testified and showed remorse, was not charged. The social consequences were equally severe. I lost friends and regained others. Rosa, who had been with the family for 2 decades, left a cake on my table the day the verdict was read. She did not speak much, but when she hugged me, I felt the texture of her apron and the warmth of plain sugar. My revenge was not violent. It was the slow and public unspooling of truth, the filing of paperwork, the exposure, records, and the insistence that the law do what it could. People sometimes ask why I used public exposure instead of a quiet settlement. The answer is blunt. When trust is the weapon, transparency is the remedy. There were moments of tension after the convictions that I will describe because they show how fragile justice can feel. One moment came when an anonymous threat arrived in an envelope with no return address. The envelope smelled faintly of cigarettes and lemon and contained a photograph of my house and a short typed line that read, "We can make this disappear." I called the authorities and felt the weight of fear in the hollow of my throat for 3 days, sleeping with the blinds closed and the phone by my hand. Another tense period was the day my bank called to say an account had been siphoned. I went to the branch, touched the cool plastic of cards, tasted copper in my mouth, and then signed forms that invoked protections the court had ordered. Those hours stretched and compressed like elastic. They lasted long enough to test my resolve and short enough to remind me that systems exist to catch thieves if you make them work. At approximately 1/3 into this narrative, I must pause here and speak directly to you. If you are feeling shock or anger or a sense that the world is unfair, you are not alone. Have you ever known someone who had legal documents changed without their knowledge? Type yes in the comments and share one short sentence about what happened. Your stories help other viewers spot red flags and could be the basis for future videos where we bring in experts to advise. Community matters. If you have documents, keep photocopies, get independent medical evaluations, and consult a lawyer who is not connected to family circles. Now back to what happened as the legal process moved toward its conclusion. The epilogue of this story deserves space and time because life after such a betrayal cannot be compressed into a single paragraph. 1 month after the verdict, I walked through my house looking for the small things the conspirators had overlooked. I found an old ledger Thomas had kept where he wrote notes about early investors. The pages smelled of dust and engine oil. I met with a financial advisor, and we began the slow process of undoing the offshore transfers as the courts ordered. I went to the marina to retrieve items from the yacht, and Marco handed me a small wooden box with an inscription that had been under the floorboards. I sat with Javier, and we drank black coffee as the harbor leaned silver, and we talked about how salt rewrites memory lines on the skin. 3 months in, I had begun to give interviews to newspersons who wanted to know how a family could fracture so completely. The interviews were invasive and oddly cathartic. I found an odd piece in telling the story aloud, in watching faces register the shock that made my experience a mirror. I also began to attend meetings with a support group for older adults who had been targets of financial abuse, led by a social worker named Hannah, who smelled of lavender and wore practical shoes. We talked about trust, about boundaries, about the paperwork that becomes a weapon. The hospital where I had worked invited me to lead a seminar on elder financial safety, and I accepted, reluctantly, because I wanted to transform my pain into prevention. 6 months later, things had shifted into a new normal. The trusts were reconstituted, oversight committees were appointed, and a legacy fund in Thomas's name began to support surgical research as he had intended. I adopted a dog named Pepper, whose coat smelled like dust and happiness, and who learned, within days, to sit on my hip when my knee ached. Elise was serving a sentence, and we received, by court order, a portion of restitution that allowed us to secure the house that had once been the theater of betrayal. Socially, I was both diminished and strangely enlarged by the attention. Some neighbors crossed the street to avoid me, others came with casseroles and questions. I found new friends in unlikely places, especially in Javier and Rosa and Paul, who visited with fish or paperwork and stayed to watch old movies that made us laugh. The final lesson is one I repeat often at seminars. Keep records, choose attorneys who are independent of family, and never assume that familial love is proof against manipulation. The law favors evidence and contemporaneous documentation, and it is astonishing how much a single recorded conversation can change lives. If this story moved you, subscribe for more cases like this and share it with someone you trust. If you have been through something similar, tell me a one-sentence version in the comments. Your voice matters. Remember that the best revenge is restoration. I lost the naive notion that blood guarantees loyalty, but I found a community that rebuilt what was taken. To end as I began, remember this line. They thought they could bury me under legal papers and polite smiles, but truth tends to surface, and when it does, it breathes again. If you want to follow the documents and exhibits from this case, they are linked below, and I will post a deep dive on probate and undue influence next week. Thank you for listening and for being part of a community that believes that inheritance belongs to history only when it is earned, and that legacy is more than money.